Look at you, a black man in a cheap suit trying to lecture cops about the law. You people always have an explanation. Maybe tonight you'll finally learn to shut up and obey. I asked why you're searching my property. Because I said so. Maybe the cuffs will teach you how to obey. See? Amazing how respectful a man becomes once he realizes nobody here cares who he thinks he is. Men like you always demand respect. Tonight you'll learn respect is something I decide whether you deserve. You should be very certain this is how you want your chief to see you. Your chief? You think he's coming to save you?
Look at you, a black man in a cheap suit trying to lecture cops about the law. Sergeant Travis Boone sneered as he seized Malcolm Hayes by the shoulder and slammed his hands onto the rain-soaked hood of the patrol cruiser. Officer Kyle Mercer snatched Malcolm's leather document bag and threw it into a muddy puddle. You people always have an explanation, Mercer mocked. Maybe tonight you'll finally learn to shut up and obey. Malcolm remained still. I asked why you're searching my property. Boone twisted Malcolm's arms behind his back. Because I said so. Click. Cold steel locked around Malcolm's wrists. Boone leaned close. Maybe the cuffs will teach you how to obey. Mercer laughed. See, amazing how respectful a man becomes once he realizes nobody here cares who he thinks he is. Boone shoved Malcolm against the cruiser again. Men like you always demand respect. Tonight you'll learn respect is something I decide whether you deserve. Officer Lena Ortiz stared at them, disturbed. Her backup body camera quietly recorded everything. Malcolm slowly looked over his shoulder. You should be very certain this is how you want your chief to see you. Boone laughed. Your chief. You think he's coming to save you? Malcolm said nothing. By tomorrow morning, Boone would wish he had. Stay with this story, comment your city and local time below, and subscribe if you believe dignity should never depend on power. 6 hours earlier, Malcolm Hayes drove into Bellridge, Ohio, without an escort ceremony or anyone waiting to shake his hand. That was exactly how he wanted it. Gray clouds hung over the old industrial city. Brick factories stood beside renovated apartment buildings, while small businesses filled the streets that connected Bellridge's working-class neighborhoods. Malcolm drove slowly. At 46, the black man had spent more than 2 decades in law enforcement. He had investigated corruption, supervised officers, rebuilt damaged units, and sat across tables from families who no longer trusted the people wearing badges. He had learned something important. Reports could describe a department. Statistics could measure it. But neither could tell him what happened when an officer believed nobody important was watching. Tomorrow morning, Malcolm was scheduled to attend a formal ceremony at Bellridge Police Department. Tonight, he wanted to see the city as an ordinary man. Deputy Chief Rebecca Sloan had offered to send a department vehicle. Malcolm declined. If everyone knows I'm coming, he had told her, I'll only see what they want me to see. Now he wore a simple charcoal suit, white shirt, and dark overcoat. No uniform. No visible badge. His leather document bag rested on the passenger seat, near West Franklin Avenue. Malcolm noticed an older sedan stopped awkwardly beside a convenience store. An elderly man stood near the open hood. Cars passed him. Nobody stopped. Malcolm pulled over. Need some help? The man looked relieved. Battery, I think. Been giving me trouble all week. His name was Henry Wallace, a retired machinist who had lived in Bellridge for 43 years. Malcolm rolled up his sleeves and helped connect jumper cables. You from around here? Henry asked. Just arrived? Business. Malcolm smiled slightly. Something like that. The engine finally turned over. Henry laughed with relief. Inside the nearby convenience store owner, Rachel Kim, offered Malcolm coffee while Henry waited to make sure his engine stayed running. Their conversation began casually. Then Malcolm asked, How do you like Bellridge? Rachel hesitated. I love the city. Something in her tone caught Malcolm's attention. But she glanced toward the street. People around here have learned to be careful. With what Rachel lowered her voice. With who they call when something goes wrong. Malcolm said nothing. Henry looked toward him. She means the police. Rachel sighed. Most officers are decent. I believe that. But there are a few. She stopped. A few what Malcolm asked. A few who make you feel like calling them was your first mistake. That sentence stayed with him. Malcolm had heard versions of it in other cities. Different neighborhoods. Different departments. Same fear. What happens when people complain? Rachel gave a humorless smile. Usually, nothing. Outside, Henry closed his hood. Malcolm thanked Rachel for the coffee and stepped back onto the sidewalk. He didn't notice the patrol cruiser turning onto West Franklin. Sergeant Travis Boone was driving. Officer Kyle Mercer sat beside him. Dispatch had reported a vague call about a suspicious individual lingering around vehicles near the convenience store. No weapon, no reported theft, no description beyond an adult male. Boone spotted Malcolm beside Henry's sedan. There. Mercer looked through the windshield. That him, probably. Boone parked aggressively near the curb. Malcolm heard the doors slam. Sir Boone's voice carried across the parking lot. Malcolm turned. Boone approached with one hand resting near his belt. Mercer moved several steps to his right. Malcolm immediately noticed their positioning. Hands where I can see them. Malcolm raised his hands slightly. They're visible. Boone stopped several feet away. What are you doing around this vehicle helping the owner? Henry stepped forward. He helped me jump the battery officer. Boone barely looked at him. I'm talking to him. Henry fell silent. Malcolm studied Boone, not angrily, carefully. What's your name? Boone asked. Malcolm Hayes. Identification. Malcolm slowly reached toward his jacket. Mercer immediately tensed. Slow. Malcolm stopped. You asked for identification. I said slow. Malcolm removed his wallet carefully and handed over his driver's license. Boone examined it. Not from Bellridge. No. What brings you here? Work. What kind? Malcolm paused. There was nothing illegal about refusing to explain his employment. But he was curious where this interaction would go. Public administration. Mercer smirked. That's supposed to mean something. Boone handed the license to Mercer. Run him. Henry frowned. Officer, I already told you he was helping me. Boone turned sharply. Sir, get back in your vehicle. But now. Henry looked at Malcolm apologetically. Malcolm gave him a small nod. It was all right, or at least Malcolm wanted Henry to believe it was. Mercer returned from the cruiser. License is clean. Boone seemed almost disappointed. Malcolm noticed. So am I free to go? The question changed Boone's expression. His jaw tightened. I'll decide when we're finished. Malcolm looked at him quietly. Boone's eyes moved toward the leather document bag sitting inside Malcolm's partially open car. What's in the bag? Documents. What kind of documents? Personal. Boone stepped toward the car. Malcolm moved once, not aggressively, simply placing himself between Boone and the open door. That bag is mine. Boone stopped. For the first time, something openly hostile appeared in his eyes. Then you won't mind opening it. I do mind. Mercer gave a short laugh. Boone stepped closer. Excuse me? Malcolm's voice remained calm. You have my identification. Your officer confirmed my license is valid. The vehicle owner told you why I'm here. If I'm being detained, tell me why. Otherwise, I'd like to leave. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Rain began tapping against the pavement. Rachel watched through the convenience store window. Henry remained inside his sedan, staring through the windshield, and Boone looked at Malcolm as though the black man had committed a far greater offense than anything dispatch had reported. He had questioned Boone's authority. Boone pointed toward the leather bag. Open it. Malcolm held his gaze. No. Boone took another step forward. That single word had just changed everything. No. The word hung between Malcolm Hayes and Sergeant Travis Boone as rain tapped steadily against the pavement. Boone stared at him. You want to try that again? Malcolm didn't move. You asked me to open my bag. I declined. Officer Kyle Mercer laughed under his breath. Listen to this guy. I declined. He stepped closer. You watch a few courtroom videos online and suddenly you think you're a lawyer? Malcolm ignored the insult. Am I suspected of committing a crime? Boone's face hardened. I ask the questions, and I'm asking whether I'm free to leave. That was when a second patrol cruiser pulled into the parking lot. Officer Lena Ortiz stepped out. She was 28, 6 years into her career, and experienced enough to recognize tension before anyone explained it. She approached cautiously. What happened? Boone pointed toward Malcolm. Possible suspicious activity. He's being uncooperative. Lena looked toward Henry Wallace. The elderly man immediately spoke. He wasn't doing anything. My battery died. That gentleman stopped to help me. Lena turned back. Then what are we investigating? Boone's eyes narrowed. I've got it handled, Ortiz. Malcolm noticed the warning in his voice. Lena noticed it too. Mercer moved toward Malcolm's car. Malcolm immediately said, I do not consent to a search. Mercer stopped beside the open door. Boone stepped directly into Malcolm's personal space. You really enjoy making things difficult, don't you? No. I simply know what I'm agreeing to. Boone smiled coldly. There it is again. What, that attitude? Malcolm studied him. What attitude? The kind where you think you're smarter than everybody wearing a badge. Rachel Kim had moved closer to the convenience store window. Henry was watching from his car. 2 customers had stopped near the entrance. Boone noticed the audience. Instead of calming him, it seemed to make him more determined to establish control. Turn around. Malcolm remained still. For what reason? Boone pointed toward the cruiser. Hands on the hood. Lena stepped forward. Sergeant, his license came back clean, right? Mercer glanced at her. Stay out of it. I'm asking a question. Boone turned toward Lena. You're here as backup, Ortiz. Be backup. She hesitated, then said quietly, We don't have anything. The parking lot went silent. Boone walked toward her. You want to repeat that? Lena held his gaze. The caller reported suspicious activity around a vehicle. The owner confirmed Mr. Hayes had permission to be here. There's no reported theft, no threat, no weapon. Boone's voice dropped. Go check your camera. My camera. It looked like the indicator was malfunctioning. Turn it off and restart it. Lena glanced down. She understood immediately. Her primary camera had been acting inconsistently earlier that shift, but the small backup unit attached beneath her outer vest was working perfectly. Boone didn't know that. Lena reached toward the primary camera. Okay. She switched it off. The backup continued recording. Malcolm saw the tiny indicator. He said nothing. Boone returned his attention to him. Hands. On. The hood. Malcolm slowly complied. Rainwater soaked his palms. Mercer reached into Malcolm's vehicle and pulled out the leather document bag. I told you I do not consent to that. Mercer held it up. Then maybe you shouldn't carry mysterious bags around. Put it back. Mercer deliberately dropped it. The bag landed in a muddy puddle. Malcolm looked down at it. For the first time, anger flickered across his face. Not because the leather mattered. Inside were documents he had spent weeks preparing notes about rebuilding public trust, officer accountability, community partnerships, and leadership standards. Boone saw Malcolm's expression. What? Malcolm looked at him. Nothing. No. Say it. Malcolm took a slow breath. I think you've already said enough for both of us. Boone grabbed his shoulder. Hard. Look at you, a black man in a cheap suit trying to lecture cops about the law. He slammed Malcolm's hands against the wet hood. Rachel covered her mouth. Henry opened his car door. Hey, he didn't do anything. Mercer pointed at him. Stay in your vehicle. Malcolm remained controlled. I'm not resisting, good, Boone said. Maybe you're finally learning. Mercer grabbed Malcolm's bag from the puddle. You people always have an explanation. Maybe tonight you'll finally learn to shut up and obey. Lena stepped forward. Sergeant, stop. Boone ignored her. He pulled Malcolm's right arm behind his back, then the left. Malcolm could have resisted. He didn't. Click. The first cuff closed. Click. The second followed. Maybe the cuffs will teach you how to obey, Boone whispered. Mercer laughed. See, amazing how respectful a man becomes once he realizes nobody here cares who he thinks he is. Boone shoved Malcolm against the cruiser again. Men like you always demand respect. Tonight you'll learn respect is something I decide whether you deserve. Lena stared at him. Her backup camera captured every word. Malcolm slowly turned his head. You should be very certain this is how you want your chief to see you. Boone laughed. Your chief? You think he's coming to save you? Malcolm said nothing. Boone pulled him away from the cruiser. We're taking him in. Lena stared at Boone. On what charge? Identity verification. Possible obstruction. We'll sort it out downtown. His identity was already verified. Boone stepped toward her. Keep challenging me in front of civilians, Ortiz, and you'll be explaining yourself to Lieutenant Cross. Lena fell silent, but she did not turn off the backup camera. Mercer opened the rear door of the cruiser. Malcolm looked at the people watching. Henry appeared ashamed that a man who had stopped to help him was now standing in handcuffs. Malcolm gave him the same small nod as before. Then he looked at Boone. No fear, no pleading. Only a strange calm that Boone mistook for surrender. Malcolm lowered himself toward the back seat. Before Mercer closed the door, he spoke quietly. Then let's go to the station. The door slammed shut, and for reasons Boone could not yet understand, those words suddenly sounded less like surrender than a promise. The ride to Bellridge Police Department lasted 11 minutes. Malcolm Hayes spent every one of them watching. Obstruction, Mercer said. That should work. Boone nodded. We'll write it clean. He listened carefully, memorizing every word, because he sensed the night was revealing something important. Those 4 words troubled him more than the cuffs. We'll write it clean. When the cruiser entered the station garage, Boone opened Malcolm's door. Out. Malcolm stepped onto the concrete. Boone marched Malcolm past the front desk. Fear had a posture. He had seen it in troubled departments before, shoulders tightening when a certain supervisor entered, voices dropping, eyes finding paperwork that suddenly seemed fascinating. Desk Sergeant Walter Briggs, a gray-haired veteran nearing retirement, looked up. "What have we got?" "Uncooperative subject," Boone said. "Possible obstruction." Briggs glanced at Malcolm. "Name, Malcolm Hayes." Briggs froze for half a second. Malcolm caught it. Hayes. Briggs repeated. "Yes." Something moved behind the older sergeant's eyes. He had seen that name recently. Boone slapped a form onto the desk. "Process the temporary detention." Briggs looked down, still thinking. Mercer removed the cuffs. Malcolm rubbed his wrists but said nothing. Boone pointed toward a chair beside the processing desk. "Sit." Malcolm sat. From there he could see most of the room. Boone and Mercer moved to a workstation several yards away. Mercer leaned toward the screen. "What exactly are we putting?" Boone lowered his voice, but not enough. "Say he repeatedly interfered with the investigation and made movements toward the vehicle after being ordered to stay back." Malcolm's eyes narrowed. That had never happened. Mercer hesitated. "He didn't really move toward. He positioned himself between me and the car." "Yeah, but write it." Mercer obeyed. A few minutes later, Lena Ortiz entered. Rain darkened the shoulders of her uniform. Boone immediately called her over. "Ortiz, I need your supplemental statement." Lena approached the workstation. Boone pointed at the report. "Confirm that Hayes repeatedly ignored commands and reached toward the vehicle." Lena read the sentence. "I didn't see him reach toward the vehicle." Boone's expression changed. He moved toward it. I saw him stand between you and the open door." "Same thing." "No, Sergeant. It isn't." Mercer stopped typing. Malcolm watched silently. Boone rose. "You want to make this difficult too. I want my statement to say what I actually saw." Boone stepped close enough that Lena had to lift her chin to maintain eye contact. "You've been here 6 years, Ortiz. That's long enough to understand how teams work." Lena's jaw tightened. "A team doesn't require me to sign something inaccurate." Boone smiled without warmth. "Careful. Careers around here can get very short when people decide they're smarter than their supervisors." Malcolm felt something shift inside him. Until that moment, he had been observing misconduct directed at himself. Now he was watching the machinery that protected it. Lena glanced toward Malcolm. For an instant, embarrassment crossed her face. She had watched Boone cuff him. She had not stopped it. But now she pushed the report back. "I'll write my own statement." She walked away. Boone stared after her. Cross is going to love that. The name caught Malcolm's attention. Lieutenant Raymond Cross. Malcolm had seen it during transition briefings. Across the room, Briggs returned to his computer. He opened the department email system and searched Malcolm's name. One result appeared. Confidential leadership transition. Briggs clicked it. The message had been distributed only to command staff and selected administrative personnel. Tomorrow, 8:00 a.m. Formal introduction of incoming Police Chief Malcolm Hayes. Briggs stared at the name. His eyes slowly moved toward the man sitting 20 feet away. Before he could open the attached photograph, Boone called across the room. "Briggs." The older sergeant quickly minimized the window. "What need you in records?" Briggs hesitated. Right now." He stood and followed Boone through a side door. Malcolm watched him leave. Nearly 40 minutes passed. No evidence appeared. No victim accused Malcolm of anything. Henry Wallace's statement confirmed Malcolm had been helping him. His identification was valid. Eventually, a watch commander reviewed the detention and found no lawful basis to continue holding him. Mercer returned Malcolm's belongings. "You're free to go." Malcolm picked up his muddy bag. Boone leaned against the desk nearby. Next time an officer gives you instructions, save yourself the trouble and cooperate. Malcolm looked at him. Is that your advice? It's common sense. Malcolm glanced at the officers around them. Some watched. Most pretended not to. That depends on what you believe the badge permits you to demand. Boone smirked. You still haven't learned. Malcolm slipped on his coat. No, he said quietly. I've learned quite a lot tonight. He walked toward the exit. Outside, the rain had weakened to a cold mist. Malcolm stopped beneath the station awning and looked back through the glass doors. Tomorrow he was supposed to enter that building as its new chief. Tonight he had entered it in handcuffs. That difference had shown him more than any transition report could have. His phone vibrated. 3 missed calls from Rebecca Sloan. Malcolm stepped away from the doors and called her. She answered immediately. Malcolm. Where are you? I've been trying to reach you. He looked through the glass at Boone laughing beside Mercer. At the station. Rebecca paused. What happened? Malcolm's gaze moved to Lena alone at a desk writing her statement, then to Briggs returning from records and watching him through the lobby. Something I think you need to know. Do I need to come down there? No. His voice became firm. And don't announce that I'm here. Rebecca went silent. Malcolm, he watched Boone take Mercer's report from the printer. Because one abusive stop was no longer the only question. The larger question was how many people inside that building had learned to look away. Malcolm tightened his grip on the phone. Rebecca, don't announce anything yet. He paused. I need to know how deep this goes. Rebecca did not answer immediately. Through the glass doors of Bellridge Police Department, Malcolm Hayes could still see Sergeant Travis Boone, talking with Officer Kyle Mercer, as though the night had ended exactly the way they wanted. Finally, Rebecca spoke. How bad? Malcolm walked toward his car. Bad enough that I don't want anyone warned. That doesn't answer my question. Boone detained me without a lawful basis. Mercer searched around my vehicle after I refused consent. They took me in, then started building the justification afterward. Rebecca inhaled sharply. They arrested the incoming chief. They detained a black man they believed had no influence. Malcolm opened his car but did not get inside. That distinction matters more. Rebecca had served Bellridge for 26 years. She knew the department's strengths, its politics, and the quiet compromises that accumulated when supervisors chose convenience over confrontation. I can have internal affairs there tonight. No. Malcolm. If Boone learns who I am now, everybody gets time to clean their desks, fix their stories, and remember the version of events that protects them. Rebecca went quiet. What do you want? Access to the transition files. Complaints, disciplinary histories, use of force reviews, body camera exceptions. Everything I was cleared to examine. You already have access. I want to know whether the records match what happened tonight. Malcolm drove to the furnished apartment the city had arranged for him. He left his muddy leather bag beside the kitchen table, removed his wet coat, and opened his laptop. At 10:17 p.m., the first files appeared. Boone had 14 citizen complaints in 6 years. Malcolm leaned closer. 14 was not proof of misconduct. Good officers could accumulate complaints, especially in difficult assignments. What mattered was the pattern. He began reading. A delivery driver claimed Boone had held him against a wall after a traffic disagreement. Closed. Insufficient evidence. A college custodian said Boone threatened arrest after the man questioned why his backpack was being searched. Closed. Officer acted within discretion. A restaurant employee alleged Boone handcuffed him during a noise complaint. even after witnesses identified him as the person who had called police. Closed. Unable to substantiate. Malcolm stopped. Different people, different years, the same language, uncooperative, failed to follow instructions, officer safety. Malcolm opened another complaint. The attached body camera field was empty. He checked another. Unavailable. Another. File error. He leaned back. His phone rang. Rebecca. I pulled the personnel summary, she said. Boone has strong arrest numbers and good evaluations. Who signs them? Lieutenant Raymond Cross. Malcolm looked at the screen. Cross again. Meanwhile, 3 miles away, Boone sat in the station break room with Mercer and 2 patrol officers. You should have seen his face when those cuffs went on, Boone said. Mercer laughed. Guy talked like he was addressing the Supreme Court. One officer smiled weakly. The other stared into his coffee. Boone noticed. What nothing? That's what I thought. Mercer leaned back. Ortiz is going to make trouble. Ortiz is going to learn how this department works. Boone's phone buzzed. A message contained a link. Local man detained after helping stranded driver. Someone had uploaded a 43-second cell phone video. Boone opened it. The footage showed Malcolm against the cruiser, while Henry Wallace shouted that Malcolm had done nothing. The view shook, but Boone's voice was clear. Maybe the cuffs will teach you how to obey. Mercer stopped smiling. How many views? 800. He refreshed. 934. Damn. Boone stood. People post half a situation and suddenly they're experts. What do? We make sure the report explains what they didn't see. Across town, Malcolm was discovering something worse. He searched complaints involving Boone by date. 4 case numbers were missing from the sequence. He checked the archive index. Nothing. He searched by complainant names referenced in monthly statistics. 2 names produced no case file at all. Malcolm called Rebecca. Were complaints ever migrated to another system 3 years ago, but old records should still be indexed? I have gaps. What kind? Cases referenced in monthly totals that no longer exist. Rebecca's tone changed. That shouldn't be possible. Who can close or remove complaint records? Internal Affairs Command System Administrator, sometimes a lieutenant with delegated review authority. Cross a pause. Yes. Malcolm stared at the missing numbers. At the station, Lena Ortiz sat alone in her car. She had finished her independent statement, but Boone's warning remained in her mind. Careers around here can get very short. She removed the backup camera and held it in her palm. The footage was still there. She could turn it in through the normal chain. That chain included Cross. Lena looked back at the station. Then she put the camera into her bag. Not yet. Inside, Boone and Mercer rewrote their report. Malcolm, meanwhile, opened the metadata for every complaint he could access. A pattern emerged. Cases involving Boone were often reviewed unusually quickly. Several were closed within 48 hours. 3 body camera failures had been approved without technical follow-up. And beside the approval field, the same identifier appeared repeatedly. R. Cross. Malcolm printed the list and arranged the pages across the kitchen table. For the first time that night, anger gave way to something colder. Concern. Boone might be reckless. Mercer might be weak. But repeated misconduct survived only when somebody made survival possible. Malcolm called Rebecca once more. I found the same approval code on the missing and incomplete cases. Whose? He looked at the name appearing again and again. Raymond Cross. Rebecca said nothing. Malcolm closed the laptop halfway. Tomorrow's ceremony had been designed to introduce a new chief. Now Malcolm understood he might be walking into something else entirely. Not a department with one bad officer. A department where someone had been teaching bad officers they would be protected. If the pattern was real, exposing Boone would be easy. Proving who had protected him would be the more dangerous fight. And before anyone learned who Malcolm Hayes really was, he intended to find out why. By midnight, Malcolm Hayes had stopped thinking about what Sergeant Travis Boone had done to him. He was thinking about everyone who had come before him. 14 complaints, missing files, corrupted recordings, and Lieutenant Raymond Cross's approval code appearing wherever accountability seemed to disappear. Malcolm opened Cross's personnel history. 23 years with Bellridge Police Department. 11 years in supervision. Excellent evaluations. Few disciplinary problems. But another pattern caught Malcolm's attention. Cross had supervised Boone for almost 7 years. During that period, complaints against Boone had repeatedly died before reaching formal review. Malcolm called Rebecca Sloan. Pull the original storage logs for Boone's body camera files. At midnight, especially at midnight. Rebecca understood. 20 minutes later, she called back. You were right. Malcolm sat upright. About what 3 recordings listed as corrupted were uploaded successfully when they were created. Then what happened? Someone later changed their status. Who had access? Rebecca hesitated. Cross. Malcolm stared at the rain streaking the apartment window. One broken camera could be equipment failure. 3 recordings disappearing after complaints were filed was something else. Across town, Lena Ortiz was still awake. The backup camera sat on her kitchen table. She had watched the footage twice. The second viewing was harder. She saw Malcolm calmly cooperating. She heard Boone escalating. She heard herself questioning him. And then she saw the moment she had stepped back. Lena closed the laptop. For years, officers had told her loyalty meant protecting the people beside her. Tonight, she finally understood the flaw in that idea. Loyalty without truth could become permission. At 12:41 a.m., she called Rebecca. Deputy Chief Ortiz, I have something you need to see. Rebecca met her 20 minutes later in a quiet administrative office away from the main patrol floor. Lena placed the camera on the desk. Boone told me to restart my primary camera. Rebecca looked at the device. This isn't your primary. No. You kept a backup running. Lena nodded. All of it is there. Rebecca inserted the memory card into a secure computer. The footage began. Malcolm refusing the search. Boone demanding obedience. Mercer dropping the bag. Then the handcuffs. Rebecca's face tightened when Boone's voice filled the room. Maybe the cuffs will teach you how to obey. She paused the video. Why didn't you intervene harder? The question hurt. Lena looked down. Because I was afraid. Of Boone. Of what happens after Boone. Rebecca understood. Lena nodded. People who challenge Boone get bad assignments. Evaluations change. Overtime disappears. Everyone knows it, but nobody can prove it. Rebecca leaned back. How long I don't know. Why bring this to me now? Lena looked at the frozen image of Malcolm in handcuffs. Because if I stay quiet again, then I'm helping them. Rebecca copied the footage into protected evidence storage. You did the right thing. No, Lena said softly. I'm doing it late. Before dawn, Malcolm watched the recording himself. He did not flinch when Boone shoved him. He did not react when Mercer mocked him. What caught his attention were the officers in the background. Some looked uncomfortable. None stepped forward. Malcolm paused the video. That's the problem, he said. Rebecca looked at him. Boone, number fear. At the station, Boone had a different problem. The cell phone video had passed 20,000 views. Lieutenant Cross entered the report room shortly after 6. "Your paperwork is weak." Boone frowned. "I wrote obstruction. You wrote conclusions. You need behavior." Cross pulled up the report. Say Hayes repeatedly approached the vehicle despite commands to remain stationary. Mercer looked uncomfortable. He didn't exactly cross-turned. "Do you want the internet deciding whether you keep your badge?" Mercer went silent. Cross continued typing. Subject displayed escalating behavior and attempted to interfere with an active investigation. Boone nodded. "That sounds better." Mercer stared at the screen. For the first time he understood they were no longer describing the incident. They were manufacturing one. Minutes later, the revised report entered the system. Malcolm received an automated copy through his transition access. He read it once, then again, attempted to interfere, repeatedly ignored commands, escalating behavior. Malcolm opened Lena's footage beside it. The contradiction was undeniable. Rebecca stood behind him. "What now?" Malcolm printed the report. "We preserve both versions. And Cross, we let him believe nobody has noticed." Rebecca studied Malcolm. "Your introduction is in 2 hours, I know. You still want to go through with it?" Malcolm looked at the footage again. Tomorrow had become today. Boone believed he had detained an ordinary civilian. Cross believed he had successfully rewritten what happened. Mercer believed agreeing with his superiors might save him. None of them understood that the evidence was already outside their control. Malcolm closed the laptop. "Rebecca, this isn't just misconduct anymore." He placed Cross's altered report beside Lena's untouched recording. "Someone is manufacturing the truth." And in less than 2 hours, the men who had manufactured it would be standing face to face with the man they had tried to turn into the lie. At 6:25 that morning, Lieutenant Raymond Cross made his first move. An internal bulletin appeared across the Bellridge Police Department network. It described the previous night's encounter as a lawful detention involving an uncooperative individual whose behavior required temporary restraint. Malcolm Hayes read every word. His name appeared twice. But the report described a man Malcolm barely recognized. Aggressive, interfering, non-compliant, potentially threatening. Rebecca Sloan stood beside him. "He's getting ahead of the video. He's building a story," Malcolm replied. "And once officers repeat it enough times, it becomes easier to defend." Malcolm closed the bulletin. Cross wasn't simply protecting Boone anymore. He was protecting the system that had protected Boone. Across the station, Officer Lena Ortiz discovered what challenging that system cost. She arrived for morning briefing and searched the assignment board. Her name was gone from patrol. Instead, she found it beneath Administrative Property Inventory. Lena stared at the screen. For 6 years, she had worked patrol. Now, hours after refusing to support Boone's report, she had been reassigned to count equipment in a basement storage room. Boone walked past, carrying coffee. "Something wrong," Lena turned. "You know exactly what's wrong." Boone smiled. "Assignments change. Right after I refused to lie for you, his smile disappeared. Be careful using words like that. I have footage." That stopped him. Only briefly. Then Boone stepped closer. "You think a camera shows everything. It shows enough." Cross reviews evidence. The meaning was unmistakable. Boone walked away. Lena stood alone. Upstairs, Malcolm learned about her reassignment. His expression hardened. "Put her back on patrol." Rebecca shook her head. "Not yet. They're retaliating against her." "I know, and every hour we wait tells every officer watching that speaking up gets punished." Rebecca lowered her voice. If you reverse the assignment before your introduction, Cross will know someone above him is involved. He'll start destroying whatever we haven't found. Malcolm turned toward the window. This was the part leadership manuals rarely captured. Sometimes doing the right thing immediately could make proving a larger wrong harder. But waiting had a human cost. Lena was paying it. Malcolm finally said, "Document the reassignment time. Preserve who authorized it." Rebecca checked. Her face changed. Cross. Malcolm nodded slowly. Add it to the file. At 6:52, Councilwoman Diane Parker received an urgent call. She had chaired the committee that recruited Malcolm. When Rebecca explained what had happened, Diane remained silent for several seconds. "You're telling me 2 officers detained the incoming chief. That's only the beginning." Rebecca described the altered report and missing complaints. Diane's voice became cold. "What do you need?" "An immediate preservation order covering complaint files, body camera archives, disciplinary records, assignment changes, and access logs." "You'll have it." At 7:03, the order reached the department's information systems administrator. No records related to Boone, Mercer, Cross, Malcolm, or Lena could be deleted or modified without generating an external audit trail. Cross noticed almost immediately. He stared at the notification on his computer. Legal preservation hold. His stomach tightened. He called Boone. "Get in here." Boone arrived with Mercer. Cross shut the office door. "Who is Hayes?" Boone frowned. "What? Who is he?" "Some guy from out of town. Some guy doesn't trigger a city preservation order 6 hours after being detained." Mercer went pale. Boone crossed his arms. Maybe he filed a complaint. At 3 a.m, Cross looked at both men. "What did he say?" Boone shrugged. "Mostly legal nonsense. Anything about knowing somebody." Mercer remembered. "He said something about our chief." Cross looked at him sharply. "What exactly?" Mercer hesitated. He asked Boone if that was how he wanted his chief to see him. The room went quiet. Cross turned toward Boone. "And you didn't think that was worth mentioning?" Boone scoffed. "I thought he was bluffing." Cross sat down. For the first time, Boone saw genuine fear in his supervisor. Meanwhile, Walter Briggs had returned to the front desk. The confidential email from the previous night still bothered him. He reopened it. Incoming Police Chief Malcolm Hayes. This time, nobody interrupted him. Briggs clicked the attachment. A professional photograph filled the screen. He stopped breathing for a moment. Same face, same eyes, same man. Briggs looked across the station. Boone was walking from Cross's office. "Sergeant." Boone stopped. "What?" Briggs almost told him. Then he remembered Malcolm sitting handcuffed while Boone rewrote the incident. He remembered Lena refusing to sign. He remembered years of complaints disappearing quietly. Briggs minimized the photograph. "Tomorrow morning, you might want to be very careful." Boone stared at him. "What's that supposed to mean?" Briggs looked toward the clock. Technically, the ceremony was scheduled for 8 that morning, but the department had been told only that command staff would make an important announcement. "It means," Briggs said, "sometimes you should know who you're dealing with before you decide how little respect they deserve." Boone's face tightened. "Do you know something?" Briggs turned back to his paperwork. "You'll find out soon enough." At 7:25, Cross attempted to access several archived complaint files. A warning appeared, access logged under preservation order. He withdrew his hand from the mouse. Too late. Whatever was happening had already moved beyond his control. Across town, Malcolm stood before a mirror. His charcoal suit from the night before hung over a chair. Beside it was something Boone had never seen: a freshly pressed command uniform. Malcolm slowly fastened it. Rebecca stood near the doorway. You could cancel the ceremony. No. You could announce the investigation privately. No. Then what are you going to do? Malcolm looked at his reflection. He thought about Henry Wallace, Rachel Kim, Lena Ortiz, every complainant whose file had disappeared, and every officer who had learned that silence was safer than honesty. This cannot become a story about two cops who accidentally handcuffed the wrong man. Rebecca waited. Malcolm turned toward her. If I punish them because I'm important, we teach the wrong lesson. What lesson do you want? That what happened last night would have been wrong if I were unemployed. Wrong if I were a mechanic. Wrong if I were homeless. He picked up his cap. And wrong if nobody ever learned my name. At 7:48, officers began entering the main briefing room. Boone sat near the front. Mercer sat beside him. Cross stood against the wall. Lena entered last, still wearing the uniform of an officer who had just been removed from patrol. Boone leaned toward Mercer. Whatever happens, stick to the report. Mercer swallowed. Then the side door opened. Deputy Chief Rebecca Sloan entered. Behind her came Councilwoman Diane Parker. Conversation stopped. Cross straightened. Boone's confidence finally cracked. Rebecca approached the podium. Good morning. She looked across the room. As you know, Bellridge begins a new chapter in its leadership today. Boone slowly turned toward Mercer. Mercer's face had gone white. Outside the room, footsteps approached. Walter Briggs stood near the rear entrance. He looked at Boone one final time. Then he looked toward the closed door and smiled sadly. Boone finally understood that everyone seemed to know something he didn't. The handle began to turn. The door opened. Malcolm Hayes stepped into the briefing room. For 1 second, Sergeant Travis Boone did not understand what he was seeing. Then every trace of confidence disappeared from his face. The black man he had shoved against a patrol cruiser hours earlier now wore a perfectly pressed command uniform. Police Chief. Malcolm walked forward slowly. Officer Kyle Mercer stopped breathing. No, he whispered. Boone turned toward him. What Mercer could barely move his lips. That's him. Lieutenant Raymond Cross stared at Malcolm, then at Rebecca Sloan. Suddenly the preservation order made sense. The missing records, the unexpected scrutiny, everything. Malcolm reached the front of the room. Rebecca stepped aside. Councilwoman Diane Parker approached the microphone. Officers, supervisors, and staff of Bellridge Police Department, it is my privilege to formally introduce the man selected after a nationwide search to lead this department. Boone's face drained of color. Chief Malcolm Hayes. Applause began, scattered at first, then stronger. Boone did not clap. Neither did Mercer. Lena Ortiz stood near the back, stunned. She remembered Malcolm's words from the parking lot. You should be very certain this is how you want your chief to see you. He had never threatened Boone. He had warned him. Malcolm stood behind the podium. His eyes moved across the room. They stopped briefly on Lena, then Cross, Mercer, finally Boone. Good morning. His voice was calm. I had prepared remarks for today. Boone swallowed. Malcolm continued. They were about trust, leadership, accountability, and the responsibility that comes with carrying authority. He paused. Last night changed those remarks. Silence swallowed the room. Malcolm reached into a small evidence envelope Rebecca had placed beside the podium. He removed a pair of handcuffs. Boone recognized them. Malcolm placed them on the table. The metallic sound seemed impossibly loud. Sergeant Boone. Boone stiffened. Sir. It was the first time he had addressed Malcolm that way. Malcolm looked directly at him. Do you recognize these? Boone glanced around. Yes, sir. You placed them on me last night. Yes, sir. Mercer stared at the floor. Malcolm rested one hand beside the cuffs. Do you remember what you told me? Boone hesitated. I don't recall my exact wording. A voice came from the back. I do. Everyone turned. Lena Ortiz stepped forward. Boone stared at her. Malcolm did not smile. So do I. He looked back at Boone. Yesterday you told me these would teach me how to obey. Nobody moved. Today we're going to discuss what that badge was supposed to teach you. Boone's jaw tightened. Chief, with respect, you're missing context. I expected you to say that. There was a call. You were interfering with an investigation. Malcolm nodded toward Rebecca. A screen behind them illuminated. 2 documents appeared side by side. The original incident report, the revised version. Malcolm turned toward the room. I have no intention of conducting a disciplinary hearing in front of an audience. Sergeant Boone is entitled to due process. Boone seemed to breathe again. Then Malcolm continued. But due process requires evidence. His eyes shifted toward Cross. And evidence requires preservation. Cross went rigid. Malcolm addressed everyone. Effective immediately, all records connected to last night's detention have been secured under an independent preservation order. Cross spoke for the first time. Chief Hayes, perhaps command staff should discuss this privately. We will. Malcolm looked at him. After I finish. Cross fell silent. Malcolm returned his attention to the room. This morning I learned that several previous complaints involving Sergeant Boone contain missing documents or unavailable body camera footage. Boone turned toward Cross. Cross refused to look at him. I also learned, Malcolm continued, that an officer who declined to support a disputed account of last night's incident was reassigned hours later. Everyone looked toward Lena. Malcolm did too. Officer Ortiz. Yes, Chief, your administrative reassignment is suspended pending review. You will face no retaliation for preserving evidence or giving a truthful statement. Lena's eyes briefly filled with emotion. Yes, sir. Boone rose. Chief, this is personal. Rebecca stepped forward, but Malcolm raised one hand. Boone continued. You're doing this because I cuffed you. Malcolm studied him. If that were true, Sergeant, you would already be out of this building. Boone went silent. I am not investigating you because you failed to recognize your new chief. Malcolm's voice became harder. I am investigating whether you abused someone because you believed he was nobody. The words landed differently. Several officers lowered their eyes. Malcolm looked around the room. The dignity of a citizen cannot depend on whether he can damage your career. Boone sat down slowly. Malcolm picked up the handcuffs. Last night gave me one incident. He returned them to the evidence envelope. The records may give us a pattern. Cross shifted toward the exit. Rebecca spoke immediately. Lieutenant Cross. He stopped. Remain in the room. Cross turned. Am I being detained? No, Malcolm said. But before you leave, you should know that every access attempt involving the archived complaint system since 7:03 this morning has been logged externally. Cross froze. For the first time, real fear appeared on his face. Malcolm had seen enough. Effective immediately, an independent review will reopen every complaint involving Sergeant Boone that was closed under Lieutenant Cross's supervision, where evidence is missing, altered, or unavailable. A murmur spread through the room. Boone stared at Cross. Mercer stared at Boone. The protection each man thought he had suddenly looked fragile. Malcolm stepped away from the podium. This department will not decide guilt by rumor. We will establish facts. Then he looked directly at Boone. All of them. Boone finally understood. The worst thing about handcuffing Malcolm Hayes was not that he had accidentally humiliated his new chief. It was that he had placed himself in front of a man who now had both the authority and the evidence to ask how many powerless people had been treated exactly the same way. And this time, no one would be allowed to make their complaints disappear. Ket thuk fan 8, noi dung jan huan than theo jung dan I jan shot. Vui long cho len, tiep tux je viet, fan 9 theo dan I. Fan 9 kauko trao, su that juox foi by approximately 1,000 words. By noon, the independent review had begun. Malcolm Hayes refused to participate as the investigator. He was the victim of the original detention, and he understood that justice could not merely be fair. It had to withstand scrutiny. An outside review team secured the records, interviewed witnesses, and recovered archived system logs. The first evidence they examined was Lena Ortiz's backup footage. Boone sat across from investigators as the video played. His own voice filled the room. Maybe the cuffs will teach you how to obey. Then came Mercer's laughter. Then Boone's second remark about deciding whether Malcolm deserved respect. Boone shifted in his chair. That clip doesn't show everything. The investigator placed the written report beside the monitor. Then explained this. The report claimed Malcolm had repeatedly approached his vehicle after being ordered away. The video showed him standing almost motionless. It claimed Malcolm displayed escalating aggression. The footage showed Boone escalating instead. It claimed officers restrained Malcolm after he attempted to interfere physically. No such attempt appeared anywhere. Mercer was interviewed next. He entered determined to protect himself. For 20 minutes, he repeated the report. Then investigators placed the first version beside the revised one. Which is accurate, Mercer stared at them. Neither answer could save him. His breathing became shallow. Finally, he whispered, the first one was closer. Closer to what? What actually happened? Who changed it? Mercer closed his eyes. Lieutenant Cross told us the report needed stronger language. Did Sergeant Boone object? No. Did you? Mercer looked down. No. That single word broke the wall. Investigators expanded the review. Old complaints were restored from server backups. A delivery driver named Samuel Price was contacted. 2 years earlier, Boone had stopped him behind an apartment complex and handcuffed him after Price questioned why his work van was being searched. His complaint had been closed. Next came Anthony Reed, a hospital maintenance worker detained during a neighborhood disturbance, despite witnesses repeatedly identifying him as an employee returning home. Then Marcus Bell, a restaurant worker who had called police for help and somehow ended the night in handcuffs himself. Different men, different circumstances, similar reports, uncooperative, aggressive, officer safety. And again, Raymond Cross had approved the findings. The deeper investigators searched, the worse it became. A server backup revealed something extraordinary. 2 years after a complaint involving unnecessary restraint. The recommendation never reached the final disciplinary board. Cross had overridden it. The accompanying body camera footage had later been classified as corrupted. Technical logs showed it had not been corrupted. It had been manually removed from the active evidence index. Cross was called into the interview room. He denied ordering anything deleted. Investigators showed him the access logs. His user credentials appeared beside the changes. Cross stared at the screen. "I was protecting the department." Malcolm, observing through authorized review channels, heard those words later. They stayed with him. Protecting the department. It was the excuse institutions used when they confused reputation with integrity. By late afternoon, Cross was suspended pending further investigation. Boone was called back. This time there was no swagger. He entered a conference room where Malcolm waited with an independent investigator and a city representative. Boone sat across from him. For several seconds, neither man spoke. Then Boone looked at Malcolm. "You wanted this." Malcolm's expression remained calm. "Wanted what? To destroy me?" "No. You stood there last night letting me do everything. You could have told me who you were." Malcolm leaned forward slightly. And then what? Boone hesitated. "You would have treated me differently." Silence. Malcolm continued. "That is exactly the problem." Boone looked away. "You set me up. I helped a stranded man. You approached me. You challenged me. I asked a lawful question. You made me look stupid." "No, Sergeant. Your decisions did that." Boone clenched his jaw. "This is revenge because I cuffed the wrong person." Malcolm's voice remained steady. "If this were revenge, I could have demanded your badge the moment I walked into that briefing room." He pushed a folder across the table. Inside were copies of restored complaints. Samuel Price, Anthony Reed, Marcus Bell, others. Malcolm tapped the folder. "This is why we're here." Boone stared at the names. Most of those were cleared by a supervisor who concealed evidence. Boone said nothing. Malcolm's voice softened but somehow became heavier. "The worst thing you did was not handcuff your new chief." Boone finally looked at him. "The worst thing was believing that the man you handcuffed had to be important before your behavior mattered." The disciplinary process continued over the following weeks. The findings were devastating. Boone had demonstrated repeated unnecessary escalation, inaccurate reporting, improper detention practices, and conduct inconsistent with department standards. After required proceedings, his employment was terminated. Cross was removed from command and referred for additional investigation concerning evidence handling retaliation and record manipulation. Mercer faced severe discipline. His cooperation mattered, but it did not erase his choices. He was removed from street duty pending a complete fitness and conduct review, with retraining required before any possible return. Lena Ortiz's reassignment was officially classified as retaliation. It was reversed. She returned to patrol. But Malcolm refused to portray her as perfect. "You hesitated," he told her privately. "I know. And then you chose the truth." Lena nodded. "I wish I'd done it sooner. So make sure the next officer doesn't have to be as afraid as you were." Weeks later, Malcolm stood before the entire department again. This time there were no handcuffs on the table, only restored complaint files. He looked at the officers before him. "Some of you believed this investigation happened because Sergeant Boone mistreated the wrong man." Nobody spoke. Malcolm shook his head. "There is no wrong man to mistreat." Lena watched from the second row. Mercer was absent. Cross's seat was empty. Malcolm continued. "Our authority is strongest when the person standing before us has no influence, no connections, and nobody powerful waiting to defend them." He paused. "Because that is when our character is tested." His gaze traveled across the room. This department will never again measure a person's worth by how powerless we think they are. The room remained silent, but it was no longer the silence Malcolm had witnessed on his first night. That silence had come from fear. This one came from people finally understanding that a badge could grant authority, but never ownership of another person's dignity. And Malcolm's real work as chief of Bellridge Police Department was only beginning. 4 months later, Bellridge Police Department looked almost the same from the outside. The same brick building stood on the same corner. The same patrol cruisers rolled through the same neighborhoods, but inside, something fundamental had changed. Chief Malcolm Hayes had refused to let Boone's firing become the end of the story. Removing one officer was easy. Changing the conditions that had allowed him to operate without accountability was harder. And Malcolm had come to Bellridge for the harder job. A new complaint system was established. No supervisor could quietly close a serious misconduct complaint involving an officer under his direct command. Body camera evidence was automatically preserved when a complaint was filed. Any deletion, modification, or unexplained loss triggered an external audit. Most importantly, officers who reported misconduct were protected from retaliatory assignments. The policy had a simple purpose. No officer should have to choose between telling the truth and protecting a career. Lena Ortiz returned to patrol. One afternoon, Malcolm found her preparing for her shift. "How's it feel being back?" Lena smiled faintly. "Better than counting flashlights in the basement." Malcolm almost smiled. Then Lena became serious. "Chief, people keep calling me brave. That bothers you a little." Why, she looked down. "Because I wasn't brave when it mattered most." Malcolm understood immediately. "You mean the parking lot?" I watched Boone escalate. I questioned him, but I still stepped back. "You were afraid. That doesn't make it right." "No." Lena looked surprised by the answer. Malcolm continued. "Courage isn't pretending fear never controlled you. Sometimes courage begins when you admit it did and decide it won't next time." Lena absorbed the words. "Then I'll do better next time." That's all leadership can ask. Kyle Mercer faced a more uncertain future. His cooperation with investigators had helped expose Cross, but cooperation after wrongdoing did not erase responsibility for participating in it. He remained off street duty while his conduct was reviewed. Malcolm personally rejected requests from some officers to either immediately fire Mercer or quietly restore him. Accountability, he insisted, could not become another form of favoritism. The same rules had to apply whether someone was hated or liked. Raymond Cross never returned to command. The investigation into evidence handling continued beyond the department, while restored complaint files were reviewed individually. Some allegations could no longer be proven. Others could. But for the first time, the people who had filed them received something many had stopped expecting. Someone listened. Samuel Price returned to the station to give another statement. Anthony Reed did too. So did Marcus Bell. Malcolm met each man briefly. He never told them that their experiences had helped shape his first months as chief. He didn't need to. Their stories were not lessons created for him. They belonged to them. That distinction mattered. Public meetings slowly changed too. At first, residents arrived angry. Some expected another polished speech followed by nothing. Malcolm let them speak. He listened when people criticized his department. He listened when He listened when officers explained the fear and uncertainty of their work. He refused the easy lie that accountability required hating police. To Malcolm, accountability meant believing the profession was important enough to demand better from it. One Saturday morning, Bellridge held a community safety meeting near West Franklin Avenue. Malcolm arrived without an entourage. Near the entrance, an elderly man stared at him. Then his eyes widened. Malcolm turned. Henry Wallace stood beside the same old sedan. Malcolm smiled. Battery still working. Henry laughed. Replaced the whole thing. Then he noticed Malcolm's uniform. The chief insignia. His mouth fell open. "You're..." Malcolm extended his hand. "Good to see you again, Henry." Henry shook it slowly. "I had no idea." "That makes two of us," Malcolm said. Henry laughed, then became emotional. "I felt terrible that night. You stopped to help me and they treated you like that." Malcolm placed a hand on his shoulder. "You told them the truth. Didn't seem to matter. It matters now." Henry looked toward the officers gathering nearby. I guess Boone really picked the wrong guy. Malcolm paused. He had heard that sentence many times since the story became public. He never liked it. "No," he said gently. Henry looked confused. There shouldn't have been a right guy. Malcolm glanced toward the street where he had once stood in handcuffs. If I had been a mechanic, Boone would still have been wrong. If I had been unemployed, he would have been wrong. If nobody had ever heard my name, he would have been wrong. Henry slowly nodded. That was the lesson Malcolm wanted Bellridge to remember. Not that officers should be careful because a stranger might secretly be powerful, but that power should never be required before dignity becomes worthy of protection. Weeks later, Malcolm stood inside the department's training room before a class of new recruits. Behind him was a small glass case. Inside rested the pair of handcuffs Boone had used. Malcolm had considered throwing them away. Instead, he preserved them. Beneath the cuffs were 3 words: "Authority reveals character." A recruit raised his hand. "Chief, why keep them?" Malcolm looked at the cuffs. Because every person wearing a badge eventually meets someone they believe cannot hurt their career. He turned toward the class. Maybe that person has no money. Maybe no connections. Maybe they're frightened, homeless, angry, or simply having the worst day of their life. The room became silent. That moment is your real test. Malcolm pointed toward the badge on the recruit's chest. Anyone can show respect to a mayor, a judge, or a police chief. He paused. Character is how you treat the person you believe has nothing you need. That evening, Malcolm left headquarters alone. No cameras followed him. No ceremony waited outside. He walked toward West Franklin Avenue as sunset reflected against the old brick buildings. 4 months earlier, he had entered Bellridge Police Department through a garage with steel around his wrists. Now he left through the front doors as its chief. But Malcolm knew the title was never the victory. The victory was that Lena no longer had to choose silence to protect her career. That old complaints could no longer simply disappear. That residents who once believed nobody would listen were beginning to speak again. And that every officer entering Bellridge Police Department now understood something Boone had forgotten. A badge could give a person authority. It could never give them ownership over another human being's dignity.
Sometimes life reveals character when we believe nobody important is watching. Real justice means treating people with dignity, not because of their title, wealth, or influence, but because they are human. If this story meant something to you, share your thoughts in the comments and subscribe for more stories that remind us why courage, truth, and respect still matter.